Welcome to our discussion of Chapter 2, Communication and Culture, the Voice and the Echo. In this chapter, we will take an in-depth look at communication and at culture, and by understanding the two separately, better understand the effect that each has upon the other. First, let's take a look at communication. We all basically know what communication is. We have been doing it our entire lives. However, to really understand how it works, we need to understand its basic functions and characteristics. Our formal definition of communication is a dynamic process in which people attempt to share their internal state or thoughts with other people through the use of symbols in particular settings. Let us examine the elements of that definition. Communication serves many different functions. One is to gather information about other people. We use communication to learn about the expectations and interests of others, their backgrounds, statuses, ambitions, etc. When we use this information, we use this information to make decisions about our interactions and future communications with those specific individuals and others like them, such as how we should present ourselves, for example, more professionally or more casually. What to talk about. For example, should we discuss politics or avoid that conversation because it seems that, based on previous communication, a political discussion with this individual may result in conflict? And whether or not to continue the communication. For example, you learn while introducing yourself to someone that this person owns a business that specializes in the field that you are studying, so you make a point to talk to this person in more detail than you originally intended, and or you make arrangements to meet for further discussion. An alternative example would be that you learn in an initial communication that the person you are meeting with is a dangerous convicted criminal who was recently released from jail. Depending on your perspective, this information may affect you or whether or not you continue to engage in conversation, whether you choose to seek further conversation, and if so, perhaps the venue and the content of that conversation. Another function is to fulfill interpersonal needs. By nature, human beings are social creatures. The degree to which we seek out human interaction and the type of interaction that we desire may vary, but we all need to interact with other human beings in order to maintain a healthy mind and body. One of the reasons for this is because we rely on human interaction to develop our own sense of self. It is largely through our interactions with and observations of others that we develop our own values, beliefs, opinions, and identities. For example, because I go to church on Sunday and engage in the collective communication of Christian beliefs, I identify as a Christian. Another alternative example would be that I go to to a rally of political activists and listen to the various speeches. Based on those communications and on the behaviors of their supporters in the audience, I decide that this group does not reflect my values, so I choose not to identify with them. Depending on the level of disagreement, I may even identify myself as an opponent to them. Another function of communication is to influence the thoughts and behaviors of others. For example, I may engage in conversation to try to persuade someone to my way of thinking. I may even use that persuasion to try to get them to do something that I want to have done. This function may be even more simplistic and common than that. For example, as a teacher, I am in the front of the classroom, and I want to have the door that is at the back of the room shut. Therefore, I point to a specific student, refer to him by name, and ask that student to go shut the door. He then gets up and shuts the door. Now let's look at some of the characteristics of communication. First of all, communication is dynamic. By that we mean that it is a constant process that involves many variables and is subject to constant change in both its own meanings and mechanisms, and also its effect on those who experience it. Communication involves many activities that are going on all at once and involves all our senses, such as hearing, seeing, touching, and thinking. Also, the messages that we receive are constantly changing us. It may be a profound change or a minute change, important or insignificant, immediate or delayed. but whenever we process new information from a communication, we have to make a decision as to its meaning and effect. Do we respond? How do we respond? When do we respond? For example, someone shouts your name, so you stop walking and you look in that direction. Or a teacher or parent gives you direction as to how to behave in a particular situation. So months or years later, when you find yourself in that situation, you then behave accordingly. Just like the communication that you receive, or just like the communications that you receive are constantly directing and changing you, the communications that you send out are also constantly directing and changing others. Communication is learned. While we may begin communicating from birth, we learn, based on our experiences and formal learning experiences, that different ways of communicating will have different effects. We therefore adjust our communications to attain the desired effect. This is a constant process because we are constantly having new experiences and new exposures to information that change what we see as effective, and because we desire new effects as our situations and goals change. We learn to effectively communicate from our personal experiences, but we also learn this from the experiences of others who have been in the same situation. Therefore, much of how we communicate is learned from the collective experiences of the persons around us, our families, communities, and organizations. Because not all groups of people have had the same experiences, and not all experiences and goals are perceived according to the same ethical perspectives, people who are exposed to different collective informational pools or teachings are going to learn different ways of communicating and responding to communications. Communications also have consequences. Because, as we illustrated earlier, communication is always having an effect on both the senders and the receivers, there is always a consequence to our communications. Communication is a powerful thing, and we will always elicit some kind of response in the receiver, even if that response is to ignore the communication. Miscommunications can result in inappropriate and unwanted responses, sometimes on a grand scale. Furthermore, once a communication is made, it cannot be erased. You can try to mitigate the results of the communication with further communication, but you cannot retract a communication once it is out there. Because of this, it is very important to make every effort to avoid miscommunications by learning to communicate effectively in multiple environments. Communication is achieved through the use of symbols. A symbol is an expression that stands for or represents something else. This can be a visual symbol or a verbal symbol, tangible or intangible. Some common symbols are crosses, stars, whistles, moans, etc. Language is a symbol system. Letters and the combination of those letters to make words have no meaning in and of themselves. They represent the meaning that our culture has decided to attach to them. All cultures use symbols to communicate, but the symbols employed and the meanings attached to them can be different. This accounts for differences in communication, even when people are conveying the same meaning. Hello and bonjour sound and look completely different, but are used by different cultures to convey the same meaning. Different cultures may also assign different meanings to the same symbol, also affecting the outcome of communication. Let's illustrate this in the next slide. Look at the symbol in the upper left. Do you know what it means? How about the one on the upper right? You may have had exposure to and can assign meaning to it. The one on the bottom left. How about the one on the bottom right? The symbol on the upper left is the Arabic word hub, meaning love. The symbol on the upper right is the Japanese word ai, meaning love. The bottom left is the word or the French word for love, amour, and the bottom right is a heart, a visual symbol that is used in many cultures to convey love. Each of these symbols looks and sounds different, but it is used by different cultures to convey the same thing. You may have been able to decipher the meaning of some of these symbols because you have learned that meaning either from your own culture or from studying other cultures, but some of them probably meant nothing to you. Sometimes the same or similar symbol will have a different meaning depending upon the cultural teaching that is influencing the person who perceives the symbol. Look at the four symbols on the bottom of the screen. They are very similar and are undoubtedly influenced by each other, but each comes from their own cultural background and has a distinct meaning to those who have been educated in that culture. Working from left to right, we have first the biological symbol for female, which is well known in modern Western societies and particularly within the medical communities. Next, we have the ancient Roman symbol for Venus, the goddess of love and fertility. Next is the Christian symbol of the cross. For some, this symbolizes the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and thus life itself and God as the bringer of life. Finally, we have the Ankh, and the ancient Egyptian symbol for life. When looking at any one of these very similar symbols, what the onlooker perceives will be based upon where he or she comes from and what he or she has learned. Perception of a symbol is also based in context. Look again at the heart. We said earlier that that meant love. We determined this in the context of the other words around it, which also meant love. In the month of February, we see this symbol everywhere and usually perceive it to be associated with love, but not always. If you were to see this symbol in a hospital, would you automatically assume that it refers to love? In most cases, you would not. In this context, you might be more likely to assume that the symbol is referring to something that is related to the workings of its biological counterpart. Thus, our perception of the meaning of the symbol is relative to the context of our perception, a facility whose purpose is to accomplish biological healing. All communication is contextual. Setting and environment help determine the words and actions you generate and the meanings that you assign to the symbols produced by other people. Every culture has defined rules of behavior that is collectively determined to be acceptable. Those rules are subject to changing environments. Location can affect the way that one may acceptably communicate. For example, the volume of speech and topics of conversation often encountered in a nightclub would be different than that would be commonly acceptable in most places of worship. Occasion can also have an effect. You will likely find people behaving differently when at a high school football stadium for a game than when they are at the same stadium to attend convocation or graduation. Time can also affect the way that we communicate. We may excuse or even encourage more direct and or abrupt communication when time is a legitimate issue for one or both parties to a communication. However, when time isn't a legitimate concern for at least one party, then overly abrupt or direct communication will seem rude, condescending, or even a sign or lack of interest, a sign of lack of interest or concern. For example, think of how you feel when you ask a professor or a question after class. How would you feel if that teacher answered you abruptly with no detail or explanation? Would you feel differently if you knew that teacher, and maybe you too, needed to be across campus in 10 minutes? Would you be less offended in that situation as opposed to if you knew that that teacher had the time to answer more fully but chose not to take it? Now let's look at the process of communication and its elements. By understanding the process in detail, we can better understand how that process can be affected by cultural differences in communication. Every communication begins with a source. This is the person who has a thought or feeling that they wish to convey to another person. In order for him or her to do so, they must first decide how they are going to do it. That is what is referred to as encoding. The source chooses the symbols and methods that are most likely going to convey their intended meaning effectively. The source then conveys their message. using the symbols that they have chosen by means of their chosen channel. For example, be written or conveyed verbally. Every communication has a receiver. The receiver is every person who perceives the communication, not just the person to whom the communication was directed. For example, if a teacher asks a particular student in the class to go shut the door, every student in the class who heard that request is a receiver, not just the student who was asked to shut the door. Every receiver must go through the process of decoding the communication that they received. This is the opposite process of encoding. The receiver will assign meaning to what he or she has perceived and provide feedback accordingly. In the above example, the teacher has verbally asked a particular student, using either a name or a gesture to indicate which student they are referring to go shut the door. All of the receivers perceive the message and go through the decoding process. If the communication is successful, the intended student will perceive that he or she is supposed to go shut the door and will do so, while all the other students will realize that the message was not intended for them and they will do nothing. Noise refers to those things which can cause interference with the above process and thus result in a miscommunication. This can take many different forms. For example, a loud noise prevents the receiver from hearing a verbal message. A sight deficiency prevents the receiver from seeing a gesture. A language barrier prevents a receiver from accurately decoding the linguistic symbols chosen by the source, or the symbols that the source chose to convey his or her message has a different meaning to the receiver. Thus you can see how, because different cultures communicate using different communication rules, symbols, and meanings, the process of communication becomes much more complicated and often fails to produce an accurate conveyance of meaning. Communication and culture are inseparable. We just discussed how communication is symbol-based and that symbols are given meaning by their cultures. Therefore, effective communication is impossible without culture. However, culture, as we're going to learn in the following slides, relies on the sharing of complicated thoughts and experiences and the ability to agree upon accepted norms. This cannot be accomplished without successful communication. As such, communication and culture are entirely interdependent. You cannot understand and achieve one without understanding and achieving the other. Here you see one formal definition of culture. Read it carefully and try to pick out the main elements of the definition. Let's talk about them. First, and possibly most importantly, culture is shared. It is to the human collective what personality is to the individual. Culture is the pooling of a common reality that allows us to communicate effectively, for the reasons discussed above, allows us to determine a shared set of values and beliefs so that we can regulate social behaviors and relations, and allows us to identify with a group of people with whom we have things in common and share a special bond. The main purpose of culture is survival. It is the lessons from our culture that gives us the tools and the societal structures to fulfill our basic human needs in a way that benefits us as individuals and as a species. Culture tells us what is important and what isn't, and how to accomplish what we need to accomplish and avoid what we need to avoid without each individual having to start from scratch learning from personal experiences alone. We use the collective standards and experiences to give us the information that we need to succeed in situations that we have not been in previously, then we build upon those experiences and ideas with our own. We also use the common agreed upon base of truth and norms to effectively work together for the common good as well as individual survival. Culture is comprised of many different elements: worldview, religion, history, values, social organizations, and language. Each of these elements contributes to the portrait of a society and to each individual within that society. The influence of culture is so profound on an individual's perspective on reality that we will be spending a good deal of time on each of these elements in detail. Let's take a look at them. First, we have worldview, the way a people interpret reality and events, including their images of themselves and how we relate to the world around them. We will be discussing this in Chapter 4. Religion serves many of the most important functions of culture: social control, conflict resolution, explanation of the unexplainable, emotional support, and group solidarity. Thus, it is one of the strongest influences on any culture, and that is also going to be discussed in Chapter 4, as religion is a type of worldview. History highlights the culture's origins, tells its members what is deemed important, and identifies the accomplishments of a culture in which they can be proud. And that will be discussed in Chapter 5. Values are our culturally defined standards of desirability, goodness, and beauty that serve as broad guidelines for social living. And that will be one of the bases of our discussions in Chapter 6. Social organizations help members of a culture to organize their lives, establish communication networks, and regulate behavioral norms. Examples of social organizations are families, schools, and governments. We will be discussing the social organization, particularly of family, in Chapter 3, and more about schools and governments as we discuss cultural history in Chapter 5. Language is the chief method of communication and therefore for the transmission of culture. Language is so important that we will be discussing it in Chapter 8. We will also be discussing another form of language, nonverbal communication, in Chapter 9. Culture is learned. We are not born knowing the influences and lessons of any particular culture. We are taught our culture informally and formally from many varied societal interactions. The process of learning our own primary culture is called enculturation. Don't confuse that with acculturation, which we learned is the process of adapting to a new culture. Because culture is learned and not genetic, we have to remember not to link it with biological categorizations such as race. For example, a child that is born in China but adopted out to a family in the United States while still an infant is not going to be culturally Chinese simply because they are biologically Chinese. The child will be a product of the culture that they are brought up in and taught. The only way the child will relate to the Chinese culture is if the adoptive parents choose to expose and enculturate the child into it. Let's look at some of the ways that we learn our culture. Proverbs are an important method of passing down the most basic, accepted, and enduring elements of our culture from one generation to the next. By packaging these lessons in short, easy-to-remember phrases and repeating them often, we are able to incorporate them into the minds of each member of a culture. Some example proverbs from our part of the world are: "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," "An apple a day keeps the doctor away," "Time is money," "A penny saved is a penny earned," and "The early bird gets the worm." Check out page 46 of your text for some more good examples from other parts of the world. We also use myths, legends, and folk tales to enculturate the next generation. These are stories that seek to teach the values of a culture as well as good and bad behaviors by pitting characters that possess culturally valued traits against characters who possess culturally negative traits, and or putting them in difficult situations in which they must use those valued traits to overcome and prevail. When we think of myths, legends, and folk tales, we often think of old stories that have stood the test of time, such as that of Paul Bunyan, Davy Crockett, and Johnny Appleseed. However, many of our pop culture stories are actually used for the purpose of enculturation and not just entertainment. A good example of this is the Rugrats. a 90s cartoon about a group of ugly but endearing babies. When you were a little kid and you were watching this show, you probably never thought that you were being taught important cultural lessons. But if you look at the elements of the show more carefully, it becomes very apparent. Each of the babies possesses unique traits that are very important to the American culture. Phil and Lil, the twins, are fearless, adventurous, and willing to try anything. This exemplifies the emphasis in our culture on bravery and innovation in the face of an unknown. Chucky, the toddler, is older and more cautious, almost to the point of being afraid. However, when it matters most, Chucky never backs down from doing whatever he needs to help his friends. This is the counter to Phil and Lil. We see a character that reminds us that blind innovation without restraint is reckless and can have negative consequences. But even in the face of caution, bravery, when necessary, should prevail. The leader of the gang is Tommy. Tommy possesses the most important characteristics to our culture: the ability to take charge, make decisions, and be fearless in the face of danger. Bravery and ability to take charge are two of the most venerated traits in the American culture. This is why we see Tommy as the most important character. Of course, we also need a nemesis. So we have Angelica. Angelica's very name is a play on words, as she is anything but angelic. She is selfish, bossy, conniving, and deceitful. In order to get what she wants, she will say or do anything, even if it means getting the babies into trouble. These are behaviors that our culture considers to be detrimental to society. Therefore, whenever Angelica engages in these behaviors, while she may prosper at first, she is usually thwarted by some heroic act by the babies. In the end, bad traits are overcome by good traits. It is also important to note that as our values change, so do our stories. The progression of characters in Disney princess movies are a good example of this. In the 30s and 40s, the characters of Snow White, Cinderella, and Aurora exemplified the traits that were considered to be desirable for women at that time: hardworking, particularly with regard to housekeeping and cooking; obedient, innocent, beautiful, kind, not overly opinionated or intelligent, and perfectly willing to be managed by the male characters around them. As the feminist movement took hold, society began to encourage different behaviors and traits in women. By the 90s and early 2000s, we see characters like Jasmine, Mulan, and Fiona. These princesses possess many characteristics that we previously viewed as primarily masculine. They decide for themselves what they want and take steps to make it happen. Jasmine, the earliest of these characters, still needs a male's help to make it happen, but Mulan and Fiona are nearly completely independent. In fact, they both, at some point in their stories, rescue the men by employing impressive fighting tactics. In the end, they were the masters of their own destinies, and they needed little to no help to do so. But they did it through the use of quick decision-making, dominance, and even violence, completely forsaking traditionally feminine traits. This mirrored the attitudes of feminism at the time. Modern princess movies show that the views on feminism and gender relations have changed again. A good example is Frozen. In this movie, the main character, Anna, is a modern girl with the ability to be beautiful, kind, and playful, but also with vices such as eating too much chocolate and making poor and rash decisions. When faced with a difficulty, she shows the bravery to step out, take charge, and take care of the problem. However, unlike the previous princesses, she needs a man's help to get her where she needs to be. Unlike before, the solution to the problem was not solely the domain of the female character or the male character, but is born out of the cooperation between the two. One could not have done what they needed to do without the help of the other. Also new to the story was the fact that love conquers all. Was not the love, or also new to the story was the fact that the love that conquers all was not the love between the man and the woman, but the love between the sisters. This is the reflection of the change in our society to place more emphasis on many forms of love beyond the traditional. I challenge you to analyze Moana as well. I think you'll find similar modern patterns in that movie. The art of a culture is also a reflection of the values of that culture. For example, cultures like Western societies that put an emphasis on the importance of the individual are more likely to have an abundance of portraiture and to feature people even in paintings that have a more general subject. Asian cultures, which put a greater emphasis on the collective than the individual, and also on the balance between humans and nature, are more likely to have art that emphasizes nature and less emphasis on the human element. Islamic culture also puts more emphasis on the collective than the individual, and the use of the human figure in art is prohibited. The portrayal of animals is also prohibited in order to prevent the creation of religious idols. Therefore their art consists mainly of geometric patterns and artfully written verses from their holy book, the Quran. Mass media is a more modern but unparalleled tool for cultural learning. The Internet, TV, books, video games, movies, etc. all play a huge part in how we think. Modern mass media tools give us a vast pool of information about not only our culture but others as well. As such, we are not only exposed to the information that our culture wants us to be exposed to, but we are exposed to many, sometimes opposing influences. The widespread availability of mass media can affect cultural change by exposing different cultures to each other. Once exposed to the teachings of another culture, we may choose to incorporate those teachings into our cultural perspective instead of the traditional teachings of our own culture. This also serves to shape our opinions of other cultures. The downside to this is that not all of the information that we get through mass media is accurate. Now let's look at some of the characteristics of culture. Culture gets its strength from its ability to endure from one generation to the next. If we do not succeed in continually transmitting our traditions to the next generation, culture ceases to exist as we know it. Culture gets its strength from the ability to endure over time. That does not mean that culture must always be passed down exactly unchanged in order for it to endure. Culture is subject to constant change. This inevitability is caused by many things, such as changing conditions which require new skills for survival and exposure to new information and ways of doing things through increased travel and literacy, as well as mass media exposure. Cultural change can be categorized into change due to innovation and change due to diffusion. Change due to innovation talks about changes to the values of society based upon the tech that is available to us. This can affect values on how to spend leisure time, productivity, human interaction and activity, how we interact with our environment, and etc. For example, with the introduction of computers to our lives, we can accomplish more tasks in less amount of time. Therefore, in order for a person to be considered a productive member of society, the expectation of what they accomplish is also increased. Change due to diffusion is affected by exposure of one culture to other cultures. This is not a new concept, but in the past such exposure was usually due to mass migration or political invasion. In either case, it was an influence that was usually affected by only two cultures on a mass scale. Today's diffusion is different because we are individually exposed to information from all the cultures of the world. Not everyone in a culture is going to experience the same exposure. Therefore, the cultural change effect is more sporadic and undefined, but due to the magnitude of overall exposure has no less a profound effect on the culture overall. When culture changes too rapidly and seemingly without logical direction, fear of and resistance to those changes can cause deep divides between people of the same culture. Depending on the level of exposure to the effects of innovation and diffusion, People have different levels of attachment to traditional ways of doing things, and this can cause conflict. We often see these divides within the same culture fall along generational lines and along urban or rural lines. Such fear of cultural change can also be the motivation between cross-cultural hatred and violence, especially when one culture blames another for the loss of their culture due to undue influence or exposure. The following 4 slides give guidance in the steps that one must take to achieve intercultural competence. I want you to read through them carefully and thoroughly and think about what you already know and what you can do to put yourself on this path. Let's take a quick look through them. First of all, motivation. Communicating with other cultures is challenging. You need to want to do it. You have to have the right motivation and the right effort. You got to put the right efforts into what you are doing. Knowledge. There are 2 different types of knowledge that you will need in order to become interculturally competent. The first is culture-specific knowledge. You must know the specific cultural values, behaviors, and communication styles of the culture that you are communicating with. Also, you need to know general information about cultures, how to understand the common elements of a culture, its variants, and its effects on human perception, which is primarily what we're focusing on in this class. We'll find also that listening skills are important in developing intercultural competence. The listening skills that we may apply in our own culture are not necessarily going to be applied the same way in every culture. Different ideas as to the meaning of silence, to the indication that volume adds to our communications, as well as to nonverbal communications, are going to change the way that we convey meaning with our words and with our gestures. And this is something that we're going to have to learn a little bit more about, and we will be discussing later on in the class as well. Accents are something that we also have to learn to listen well with. Listening intently and being patient when communicating with someone who has an accent can affect the way we communicate it with somebody from a different culture. We will discuss more about accents in Chapter 8. Also, we need to keep an open mind. You don't have to agree with what another person says, but we do have to make sure that we are attempting to understand it from their cultural perspective. Therefore, when you hear people speak, when you listen to someone speak, don't just close your mind simply because you don't understand or you don't agree with what they're saying. You need to listen to what they're saying and try to understand why they're saying it from their perspective, even if you don't ultimately agree with it. Be flexible in the way that you communicate. Understand that variations in cultural communication skills will require you to adapt your own communication behaviors in order to communicate effectively with the person that you are attempting to communicate with. There is a Spanish proverb that says, "I dance to the tune that is played." You do not always have to communicate in the way that your culture has taught you to communicate. Sometimes it's important to learn how to communicate in another person's methods. Make sure to try to tolerate ambiguity. Don't allow yourself to become too self-conscious or anxious when you don't always know exactly what's going on. This is going to be something that you find when you're communicating interculturally happens a lot. You may not always understand exactly what's going on because maybe you have some language barriers, or maybe you haven't understood the culture and why people are doing things the way they're doing as well as you could. So you want to make sure that you're preparing yourself for that situation in order to avoid the anxiety that sometimes will come with a situation like that. One good way to do that is to listen to music in languages that you don't understand. If you find that listening to other languages, not understanding what's going on, is making you uncomfortable, listen to this music. The great thing about listening to music in other languages is not only that you are hearing other languages, but the fact that you don't understand it but still can enjoy the music and maybe even find yourself singing along, saying words that you have no idea what they mean. The fact that you're enjoying that makes you feel more comfortable in a situation where the meaning is ambiguous. And it really is a great way to practice being tolerant of that type of ambiguity. In conclusion, I want to just say that uh, it's really important to have the basic understanding of how culture and communication work. In order to understand and become interculturally competent, we need to have this base understanding so that we can understand why communication can be difficult between cultures. Not just understand that it is, but understand why it is. Once you understand the basics of why communication can be altered, then we can start taking the proper steps to make sure that we are effectively communicating and overcoming the barriers to communication. All right, that's it for this chapter, and I will talk to you in the next chapter. Bye.